Okay, so this week we're going to talk about the different character types that Aristotle discusses, and mainly we're going to focus on continence and incontinence, and the real focus at the end is going to be on incontinence. Now, the way to start this is to just list the six character types that Aristotle discusses. There's, we'll start at the bottom. The worst character type is what he calls the brutish. Then there's the vicious character type. This is somebody who has vice as a habit or way of life. There's the incontinent person. So those are the three what we call more negative character types that lead people toward sin or toward badness, or character types that involve a more problematic ordering of the soul, or a disorder of the soul, probably is a better way to describe it. Now, the more positive character types, we'll start with the continent, and then there's the virtuous, and finally there's the godlike. So those are the six. There's three negative, which are the brutish, vicious, and incontinent. And then there's three more positive ones, which are the continent, virtuous, and godlike. Now, let me just kind of describe this in a little bit more detail so you have a basic sense of what's going on. A brutish person for Aristotle is somebody whose rational faculty or intellect isn't really working at all. The person doesn't really have a knowledge about much of right and wrong and ethics at all. The person being brutish is almost more like an animal being purely led by instincts and appetites. This is, Aristotle says, very rare. And when I think of the brutish character type kind of today, what comes to mind might be somebody like Jeffrey Dahmer. He was a serial killer in Milwaukee who would have sex with young men and then kill them, put them in the bodies in the basement, and then he would eat them. And just totally, absolutely bizarre and heinous and perverted behavior. But it's really, as the expression goes, so far beyond the pale, it's difficult to imagine what this is. It's the sort of behavior that luckily nobody really uh, partakes of. Most people are not anywhere near that. So that's the absolute extreme of a character type that is completely corrupted its human nature. We talked earlier about this idea that human nature, properly done, is where the rational faculty is governing and coaching and directing the appetitive faculty. When the rational faculty is not operative at all, when it's not really doing anything and leading the person toward an understanding of basic sense of right and wrong, that soul, that human nature is completely corrupted in one sense, according to Aristotle. Now, there are questions about, well, how can this happen? How can this arise? Aristotle hints at something that I think actually is relevant. We can talk about it today as well, and that would be something like, first of all, illness. Something has happened to somebody in such a way that their mind is really warped. Mental illness is part of this. We can think of diseases like schizophrenia, where somebody has just lost touch with reality. Um, there's also situations where people become sociopathic. They don't have much of a sense of a conscience. So these are cases where, for various reasons, they can be biological, biochemical, neurological, who knows. A person's capacity to reason and rationalize and use that rational faculty has been so compromised and so damaged that, like I said earlier, a basic sense of right and wrong, a basic understanding that, for example, you don't eat people that you've killed, that basic understanding isn't even there. The person is not even able to operate on this fundamental level of morality. I just want to say a brief word about that. Most people don't really have to think long and hard about the fact that you don't eat other people. You don't keep people in your basement after you've killed them. You don't kill other people, for example. That's just kind of almost hardwired into us. Aquinas talks about this with an interesting term. He calls it synderesis or synderesis, however you want to pronounce the Latin. One of the things he's getting at is this basic understanding of fundamental principles of right and wrong, or good and bad. Um, and Aquinas kind of asserts that this is pretty much hardwired into us. Something has to have gone very wrong, or you could say haywire, for this hardwire to be non-functioning. And an analogy, if we're going with this hardwiring thing, is the way that a computer is hardwired such that, when you turn it on, a screen pops up and you see various icons that you can click on and do stuff with. But a computer that's gone haywire is one in which the screen is all fuzzy and the icons are popping in and out and they're moving around. And when you touch the mouse, the computer turns off and things are just totally malfunctioning. Something similar is occurring, says Aristotle, in the situation with the brutish person. The natural orientation of a person as a human being towards some sense of right and wrong and some ability to operate with that has been turned not only just upside down, but it's gone every which way. It's not even, it's the person loses the capacity to be recognized as a human being in some sense. Like I said earlier, they've almost descended to an animal level. And Aristotle kind of hints at something that comes into play here insofar as the further the person's reasoning is warped and gone haywire and non-functioning, the less liable in some sense the person is. And in other words, if somebody has a mental illness that's so severe that they can't think straight and they don't recognize basic things about right and wrong or good and evil, and they're not able to get an understanding of that, and their mind is so corrupted through illness or something of that sort, it's difficult to say the person is entirely culpable for what he's doing. A lion that tears apart a gazelle or a zebra, it's a very violent and brutal act. But the lion doesn't, in one sense, know this. It doesn't have a mental or rational understanding of what it's doing. It doesn't have a mental or rational understanding of principles of ethics or morality. And therefore, we can't talk about what the lion is doing as wrong, and we can't say the lion is culpable. For example, even if a lion attacks a human being, it's a very violent, horrible act, but we don't think the lion is morally or ethically wrong for having done so. On the other hand, and Aristotle's kind of saying, I think, something similar, that if somebody's human capacities are very deeply corrupted and warped and gone haywire, and they descend more and more toward this animal level, then at a certain point, we're left wondering, is the person even fully culpable for what he has done? Can he take responsibility for it? And should we blame him for it? And I'm not trying to answer any of these questions. I don't know how to parse that out, but that's kind of what Aristotle's hinting at. So that's in a sense the brutish character type, the most extreme, utterly bizarre, fundamentally lacking a sense of knowledge of right and wrong, and this gone haywire, this human nature gone haywire. All right. Now, the next character type is the vicious. Now, this is the case where somebody's mind or reasoning faculty has not gone haywire. In one sense, they still have a good understanding of, or a basic understanding that there is a sense of right and wrong in the world. And they are not suffering from these diseases, these mental illnesses, etc. But what happens with a vicious person more so is that the person just kind of wants to be bad. They, in the end, use the reasoning capacity they have to serve their more basic and misguided instincts. So one case of this would be somebody who, like in Mozart's work on Don Giovanni or Don Juan, what does Don Giovanni want? Well, he just wants to live as a Lothario, to have as much wine, women, and song as he possibly can. So he sees that as the best and really the most essential thing he can do with his life. But he's cunning. He's able to use his reason to seduce women and to get the pleasurable things of life. He's very intelligent and charming, and he thinks about this to some extent. He's not just led by instinct or brute animal passion in a way. He's using his mind to achieve these bad ends. And therefore, it's not like the brutish, where the mental and reasoning and thinking capacity has gone haywire. His mental and reasoning capacity is still functioning. It's actually functioning at a fairly high level. It's just being subservient to his desire for pleasure and sex and alcohol and stuff like that, and to kind of live this debaucherous lifestyle, if you will, and engage in all sorts of promiscuity. Now, this kind of person becomes habituated to this. It becomes a deeply ingrained way of life for him. So it's important to bear in mind that for Aristotle, the person who has the character type of viciousness or vice is not just somebody who slips up occasionally, or somebody who has a strong desire to have sex with somebody, or gets drunk every once in a while. It's more so somebody who has become super focused on and deeply committed to living a life of sin, living a life of purely of just pleasure, living a life of almost debauchery, or living a life that is a corruption of his human nature. He has wanted to corrupt his human nature. The brutish person had no choice in that, whereas the vicious person wants to do that and makes that a goal of his life, makes that something he strives for and tries to live out. Now, Don Giovanni, again, is I think, a good example of this. Another interesting example might, and this is beyond what Aristotle has talked about, but it might be people who have committed themselves to something really heinous, but they're doing it in a reasoned, thoughtful way. Now, let's look at the example of some of the Nazi criminals in World War II. One thing that came out during the trial at Nuremberg, and then the trial of somebody like Adolf Eichmann in 1960 in Israel, was that these guys were not insane. They weren't crazy. They, in other words, weren't like the brutish people we've been talking about. They were intelligent, they were thoughtful, etc. And another thing that came out was that they used their intelligence, their thoughtfulness, their ability to plan to carry out absolutely nefarious and totally evil ends. So this is something we see with Hitler's infamous and horrible phrase, the final solution. Well, what was the final solution? The final solution was Hitler's plan to exterminate and wipe out the Jews from Europe. Hitler felt that the Jews were the cause of all of these various problems that the German people had suffered, and they needed to be utterly wiped out. And therefore, he tried to carry out a total genocide against the Jewish people. But let's hone in on the term final solution. Now, a solution in general is an answer to a problem. For example, there's a math problem that you need to solve, and you need to find the solution to it. Or something's wrong with your car, you need to fix it or find the solution to it. What we notice here is that rational agents who can think about a situation, figure out what needs to get done, apply that knowledge, reflect on that knowledge, try something better. If plan A doesn't work, you implement plan B, etc. Rational agents are the ones who work towards solutions and who solve problems. They are the ones who take responsibility for it and can be praised for having done so. So a rational agent is the one who carries out a solution. And if we take that to discuss Hitler's notion of a final solution, then what we see is necessarily Hitler and the leading Nazis were rational agents. They were doing this voluntarily. They were doing this, and it's an odd term, but thoughtfully. They were thinking about what they wanted to do. Anna Arendt, in her observations, described this as, she calls it, I think it's a brilliant phrase, she calls it the banality of evil. Evil is very banal. It's mundane in one sense. It's not that these people looked like little devils, or they're foaming at the mouth, and they looked crazy. They were ordinary, actually almost above average intelligent people who were carrying out thought out plans to effect a genocide. And that means that somebody has committed to this. They're using their rational faculty, which ought to be here, to serve some horrible, horrible end. And that means it's not that they're without reason, it's that the reason has become directed toward total evil. And they're committed to that, and they've made it a way of life. And so I think we see various examples, again, of this vicious character type. It's somebody who's committed to living this way, who's made this a habit, and has used his reason toward evil ends. Now, just to reiterate, Aristotle's example, I think, would be somebody like Don Giovanni and Mozart's work. But I think a broader understanding helps us to see that some of these dictators and really horrible leaders of the last 100 years, Pol Pot, Joseph Stalin, Mao Zedong, Adolf Hitler, etc., they would also, I think, be people committed, people who are vicious, whose understanding of, who used their intelligence in a way that's totally contrary to what is basically good. The brutish person had no intelligent understanding of that. The vicious person does have some understanding, but says, screw it, I want something horrible, and I'm going to use my reason to get that. I'm going to willfully corrupt and my reasoning ability towards something awful. All right, now let's talk about the incontinent character type. Now, the incontinent character type is basically somebody who has a good sense of what's right and wrong. and not whose reasoning is working well. And he hasn't, unlike the vicious person, he hasn't committed to living a life of vice or sin or depravity. That's not what he deeply wants. And he probably has a more well thought out understanding of right and wrong too than the person with vice. He has a more robust sense of what things are good and what things are bad. And he's correct in his reasoning about a lot of this. So on one level, he knows what's good and he kind of wants what's good, or sort of tends towards that. But he does not carry out this knowledge. He doesn't put it into practice. So this is somebody who, for example, knows that, like, okay, I really should not eat 5 pieces of pizza. I should probably stop at 2, maybe 3, but I really shouldn't eat 5. And he knows that. As a matter of fact, he may tell himself, look, self, don't do that. That's not good. So what ends up happening? Well, what ends up happening is that he tastes one, it's pretty good. He tastes the second, oh, that's good. He's fine, just does it. He gives in. He follows through. There's a way in which temporarily the reasoning becomes subservient to the passions. Or another way to describe it is that the emotional desire for something like good food or pizza becomes so strong that it takes over and leads him to do this action of eating the 5 pieces of pizza. The reasoning no longer is we used the example earlier of the charioteer. In this case, the charioteer has become very weak, or he loses control temporarily of the horses. And the horses in this case are pretty unruly, and they take off and they do their thing. And he wants to hold them together. He wants to properly rein them in, if you will, but he's either too weak or he's not, they break loose or whatever. And so he ends up being led by his emotions to carry out this action. Now, this can occur, says Aristotle, primarily with regard to things involving pleasure, sex, food, alcohol, etc. And Aristotle says it can also occur sometimes in a more qualified way, things like anger. And this is, I think, also another example. And again, Aristotle doesn't think this is a prime example of incontinence, but it's sort of a secondary example, if you will. And that is the case where, somebody says something that I disagree with. Actually, perhaps politics is a good thing we could talk about. A helpful instance of these cases. And a lot of people are discussing politics these days. The Democratic primaries are going on. The election is coming up in a number of months. There are a lot of political issues in the air, shall we say. And there's a lot of very divergent political views. There's a lot of kind of animosity in the political climate. So what can happen is, either in person or on social media, let's say person X makes a comment, and I feel it's a stupid comment, or I feel that it's an offensive comment, or that it undermines a movement that I think is good, or it's attacking somebody, or it's promoting a really bad idea. So I feel this wellspring of anger coming up in me, and it's becoming more powerful, and I'm facing a critical juncture here, a very important point of decision. Now, one of the things that can happen is that I realize, okay, it's not worth it. It's a Facebook post. And sometimes that's it. You just say the words out loud and reflect on them momentarily, and you realize it's a post on Facebook. It doesn't matter. So we have that understanding. Now, that's that's the case where you have the understanding and you say it's just a Facebook post. I don't need to worry about it. You X out of Facebook, done. The other case is where you say, okay, it's just Facebook, but then this other part, this anger you just let it kind of overpower you. You're like, no, I'm going to tell that person what's what. I'm not going to let this stand. And then you write the angry, mean, kind of attacking, aggressive response to the person's post on Facebook. And you say, you're an idiot. This is dumb. What are you saying, man? Blah, 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 blah. And it potentially even harm your friendship as a result. Now, let's just kind of go back and analyze that. It looks like, in this case, I'll use myself as an example. I knew what was going on. I knew that it's just a Facebook post. It doesn't really matter. It's not that important. I have the knowledge. In one instance, I carry out that knowledge, shut down, turn Facebook off, whatever, turn the computer off, walk away. That's path A. Path B, though, this is where we're getting into the discussion on incontinence. Path B is where incontinence comes into play. And this is where I have the knowledge, I have the sense that this is not, that it doesn't really matter, I should just walk away. But something else in me feels very strongly about this, feels this is a matter of justice, gets all worked up and angry about it, and then responds in an angry, assertive, aggressive way. And that's where the anger has taken over. The anger has led me to do this. Not me rationally, thoughtfully considering what to do, but the anger kind of acting over and against and contradistinction to my reasoning leads me to respond in this way. So we'll go back to that example of the horse driver on the carriage with the horses in front of him. This is where I think, okay, I want to turn left, but the horse becomes too strong and the rope or bridles connecting me to the horse are too weak. And instead of me turning left, which is where I know I want to go, the horse leads me to the right, which is contrary to where I know I want to go. So that's a basic sense of incontinence. And we're going to get into a lot more of discussion on it, but I just kind of wanted to give you that sense that it's an instance where we kind of have a sense of what is good. We know it. And in one way we want that. We think this is good. I should do it. But we don't act on that knowledge. We don't carry it out. We act against kind of what part of us wants and part of us knows to be the good thing to do. Incontinence. The next is continence. And briefly, continence is where we know what we should do and we carry out that knowledge and we do the right thing, we do what's good, but it's a struggle. Now, with both the incontinent and the continent person, our emotions are very powerful. In other words, they're not the well-coached, well-directed, properly refined, properly matured emotions that we talked about with the virtuous person a couple video lectures back. These are not well-trained horses, in other words. They're kind of wild horses. And if we use this analogy again, the wild horses with the incontinent person eventually took over and led the chariot in a certain direction. With the continent person, on the other hand, he is strong enough to bring those wild horses around and to ride them to the proper place. But he's exhausted and the horses are exhausted. And it's a real struggle the whole time. He's got to hang on for dear life. Or to take it a little bit of a, to continue on the horse analogy, but say instead of the person being on a chariot, he's just on the horse he's on the horse itself. And it's an untamed horse. It's kind of wild. And he's constantly having to redirect the horse and redirect the horse and put his feet into the stirrups to do this and rein it back. And the horse wants to go to the left and he wants to go to the right and then vice versa. And he wants to go fast. Now he gets the horse to where he wants to go, but it's an exhausting, difficult struggle. It's a very tough process. Now let's actually bring that analogy back down and talk about this in terms of more what we could call real life examples. So an example would be, we'll go back to the pizza example. Yeah, it's actually a fairly decent example. Most people have eaten pizza. Most people probably either wanted to or ended up eating more pizza than they probably should at some point in his or her life. I know I have. Now, the incontinent person, like we said, eventually just he knows he shouldn't have the pieces of pizza, but he does end up eating them. Now, the continent person also does want that. He has these strong emotional drive for it. That's what he wants. He wants an excess, in other words. He wants too much. He wants something that's fatty and not really good for him. That's where his emotions are going to lead him. And he recognizes, okay, but this isn't good, and I don't really want it, but part of me does want it. And he's kind of torn here. But what he might end up doing here, he says, okay, I can't deal with this anymore. He takes the pizza, he takes the 5 pieces of pizza, and he throws them away in the trash. Fine, I did it. I did not eat those pieces of pizza. I was able to, in other words, resist the temptation or put it away. Or another thing he might do here is to literally walk out of the room or walk out of the place where the pizzas are and say, it's too much. I just can't deal with it. So he ends up doing what's probably best in this situation. But it was really tough for him to do it. And he kind of had to do something extreme in order to carry out and apply his knowledge of what was best. It wasn't easy for him to do it. You know, if it were easy, he could just be like, all right, there's 1 piece. I don't want it anymore. Fine. This was like, oh, I really want it. What am I going to do? You know, or if somebody really wants to smoke a cigarette, you know, they'll pop gum in their mouth. They'll pace back and forth. They end up not smoking the cigarette, but it took a lot of mental and emotional energy for them to actually end up not giving in to that temptation or for them to resist that temptation. So the incontinent person and the continent person are similar in that their emotions are very strongly geared toward what's extreme. The difference is that the continent person is able to not always give in to those. He's able to resist them. He's able to endure that and realize the good action, carry out the good action, do what's best. Whereas the incontinent person is more prone to fall and give in and not able to resist. All right, so that's again a brief overview of continence, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. So the next one, of course, is the virtuous character type. Now, I don't really think I need to say much on this because we've talked a lot. We talked a lot about this in some of the videos early on, I believe, for week 2, or yeah, whatever it was. And Though that, just to briefly, what virtue has to do with is where the rational faculty is properly governing, properly coaching, and directing and refining the appetitive faculty. It's where we're carrying out the proper work of our soul. It's where our souls are in good working order. It's where we're fulfilling our human function. To use the chariot example, it's where the horses are going in the right way at the right time, in the right speed, with the right effort. It's a gentle, almost pleasurable ride of life in this regard. Whereas for the continent person, it was a struggle, and he kind of got there. For the incontinent person, it was also a struggle, but he didn't even get to the right place. And the vicious person, he's just got the horse going in the wrong direction, and that's what he wants. So the virtuous person has a smooth and graceful way of acting well. His habitual way of living is such that his emotions are matured toward their proper object, like I described last time. He wants what's best for him in a deep and long-lasting way. He wants what's best for him. He wants to just have the moderate amount. He wants to do what's courageous. He wants to have the proper amount of of anger. He wants to be witty and charming. He takes proper pride in what he has done. Again, looking back at all these various emotions that we've talked about. So the emotional life of this person is well oriented and matured, and the soul of this person is in good working order. All to use a colloquial expression, the cylinders are all firing at max. There's not the kind of tumult, war, and tension that we saw with the incontinent and the continent person, nor is there the total warping and misdirection that we saw with the brutish person who has gone haywire and the vicious person who's used his reason to pursue what is the opposite of good, and that is evil. So the virtuous person has a more, we could say, gentle soul, because the soul is at peace with itself, carrying out what's best. Now, this virtue, though, as we've talked a lot about in this class, is a habit. And if it's a habit, it's something the person has worked on to acquire. He has practiced in a good way. He has reflected on this. He has done these actions over and over and over again. Remember what Aristotle says. It's by performing just acts that we become just, and by performing courageous acts that we become courageous. By following the example of the ethical paradigm that we ourselves eventually become properly virtuous as a habitual way of life. So we have to work on it for it to become this deeply ingrained habit part of us. This becomes our second nature, but again, as Aristotle says, it's not innate to us. So that's a brief overview of the virtuous character type. And this is something we have talked a fair amount about, so I don't want to I don't think we need to repeat a lot of it. The final character type is the godlike. Now, the godlike seems to be somebody who just innately is good. And you're like, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. We were talking about this goodness of life being something that is a habit. And if it's a habit, something that is acquired and worked on and perfected, but not innate, not in us just by nature. So how can there be innate goodness of this sort, of the godlike person? Well, first of all, says Aristotle, this is a rare, very rare thing. In that regard, it's the counter opposite of the brutish person, which is also very, very rare. And we got to hone in on this term godlike. I think what Aristotle was saying was that it's almost like a gift from the gods. Everybody, as human beings, for the most part, is just going to have to work on being good. But occasionally, maybe, says Aristotle, the gods will grant to somebody this innate goodness. Now, it's interesting to think from a Catholic perspective of somebody like Mary and see if she might fit this. Now, the context is very different. This is a Christian context we're talking about with Mary. Aristotle is a pagan. Mary is the mother of God. That is incomprehensible to Aristotle's pagan worldview. So there's all sorts of important differences. But the idea of an immaculate conception, being born full of grace, the way that Mary was, that might be something similar to what Aristotle's getting at. But the final thing I would say about the godlike is that just as most of us don't really run the risk of going brutish, most of us don't really run the risk of being godlike. So we don't really, it's not really an important part of our reflection on what it means to live a good life. I want to expand on that just a bit more. See, sometimes when we're talking about morality or ethics, we end up thinking just in terms of not only paradigms or good examples to follow, we end up thinking in terms of ideals. And not only just ideals, but I would say idealizations, such that the ethical life becomes, dare I say, impractical because people think it's just about living out these idealized actions or these idealized habits or these idealized forms of life, manners of living. So this would be somebody who thinks that you always have to hold the door for every single person that you ever see who's about to go in a door. Otherwise, you might be being selfish in some small, tiny corner of your soul. And that selfishness is bad. And therefore, you can't carry out that selfishness. So you just got to go and hold the door for every single person that you see. Or when you're driving, you have to let in every car in front of you, or you always have to be the absolute nicest person in a room or something like that. And so the ethical life becomes one in which you're trying to just carry out this almost superhuman task. Now, hopefully what you've gotten through this course is that that's not what Aristotle's saying. He's not prescribing us a course of life that's superhuman. Yeah, I mean, in some senses, it's beyond what we normally do, and it's calling us to transcend some of our habitual ways of acting and grow and get better. So it's not just being satisfied with the status quo of our lives, but nor is it advocating that we try to embrace an angelic ideal and be this 100% absolutely perfect person. Human beings necessarily make mistakes. We have foibles. We don't do things perfectly. Let me expand that a bit more. I've used the analogy of basketball and sports to help explain some of these ideas about living ethically. And we talk about basketball. In my mind, the greatest basketball player ever lived is Michael Jordan. And I'd be willing to back that up in an argument. But anyway, Jordan is an incredible basketball player. But there's also this great ad that Jordan did once for the Nike Air Jordans where he said, I've missed over 10,000 shots in my career. I've lost over 300 games. 26 times I was entrusted to take the game-winning shot and I missed. I have failed, he says, over and over and over again in my life, and that is why I succeed. In other words, the greatest basketball player who ever lived failed a lot. Go with baseball. The greatest baseball hitters who ever lived made hits about 1/3 of the time they were up to bat. That's actually kind of a bad ratio in one sense if you think about it. Okay, like Mike Trout, the best baseball player alive today, the guy's averaging like 310, I think. And I mean, he's a tremendous baseball player. But just seeing this through the lens of statistics, we notice that he's getting a hit like 3 times out of 10 times he's at bat. Now, what this indicates in my mind is the fact that the people who are doing the best in these sports are not perfect. The people who are the paradigms of what it means to be a good athlete in these sports are not perfect. Failure is par for the course, to use another sports analogy, okay? Now, if failure is par for the course in sports, and sports are a helpful, illuminating analog of the ethical life, then failure is going to be an element of our living ethically. What do I mean by that? Well, I don't mean that we're going to just live out where we're at in life and never get better, to reiterate what I said earlier. The ethical life does necessarily involve improvement, getting better, being more and more and more and more virtuous. But even as you ascend in this mountain of virtue, to talk in those regards, you're still going to slip up. You're not going to ever be at the perfect, absolute pinnacle top. Part of what I'm saying here is that, yes, the virtuous person lives really well, but he's living a human life really well. And humans are limited, finite creatures who, as Christianity says, are always wrestling with original sin. So what follows from that is pretty clear, I think. What follows from that is that living ethically really well in a virtuous manner as a habit that you put into practice is a really, really good thing, but it's not necessarily a perfect thing. It's not an absolutely immaculate, refined, total success, if you will. But it's still worth striving for and putting into practice. It's the best we do. It is us fulfilling our human nature. And that is the enactment of virtue. So let me get more clear about this. In other words, living ethically well does not mean we put into practice or we instantiate always this absolute ideal. We follow the paradigm who is a person who lives ethically well. So to go back to what I said about the godlike, saints whom we can see as ethical paradigms worthy of emulating are ethical paradigms because they share in our human condition. They share with us the state of having to grow in virtue. So when we're thinking about something like the godlike state in Aristotle and how absolutely rare it is, we shouldn't take that to mean either of the following things. We shouldn't take that to mean either, well, that's the real paradigm of ethical living, and that's what I should strive for. Nor should we take that to mean that's the real paradigm of ethical living. That's what I should strive for. And but I know I'll never get there, so I may as well give up. Both of those options are predicated on a misunderstanding. What's the misunderstanding? The misunderstanding is that you're taking the rarest of instances and holding up as that absolute ideal and saying this is what we all need or should do, rather than saying let's look at the best paradigms all around us, or from our tradition, or from people we know, or from, like with Aristotle, from from the Greek stories, and say this is what we should try to put into practice. So the ethical life is not necessarily the absolutely 100% pure and perfect life, but it is the good life. And I think that can sometimes get lost. So I just wanted to clarify that. The godlike person, when we're talking about ethics, is not the paradigm. The virtuous person is the paradigm. The godlike person is the rare exception that proves the rule, in other words. Okay, so that wraps up the discussion on the 6 character types. And in the next videos, we're going to focus more in on continence and incontinence.